It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to yet another wonderful episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. I have a very special guest for today's episode. He is, among other things, a theoretical physicist. Barry, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
His name is Barry Clark, fellow Quillers, and among being a theoretical physicist, he is many other things that we'll discuss in our conversation today, including author of Francis Bacon's Contribution to Shakespeare, A New Attribution Method. But before we dive in to Barry's work on the Shakespeare authorship mystery, a little bit of business, fellow Quillers. I know we ask you regularly to give the show a rating and or a review at your favorite streaming site, but I can't emphasize enough how much that helps other potential members of the Quiller Nation to discover our mystery and join our growing worldwide population of super sleuths. So if you haven't already rated and reviewed the show at various sites, please do that to help spread the word. Also, by now, those of you on our email subscriber list have received some of the exciting details for our Quiller event coming in April. It has been great receiving all of the response emails about the excitement that is generating about the event. I promise you this is going to be the greatest authorship event in recent history, maybe just beneath the U.S. Supreme Court mock trial from the late 1980s. Professional performances, expert presenters, a marathon day of Shakespeare history plays, social opportunities, and the chance to explore beautiful Minneapolis along the mighty Mississippi River. If I were you, I'd start looking at travel arrangements now for April 11th through the 14th, 2024. You won't want to miss out on this exceptional event. Barry, with your background in such a plethora of pursuits, television writer and consultant, brain twister puzzle creator with more than 1,500 puzzles published in newspapers and an entire grip of brain puzzle books, short film writer and award-winning short film maker, and player of guitar even. I mean, you are one of these polymath type of guys, so it's no wonder you found the authorship mystery. But tell us a little bit about your early discovery before you explain the journey that led to your book, Francis Bacon's Contribution to Shakespeare.
As you correctly say, my background's in physics. I got a Bachelor of Science degree in 81, Master of Science in Quantum Mechanics in 84. So that's my background training. Published a couple of papers on quantum mechanics. As you say, I went off and did some other things, filmmaking in the late 90s. 89, I started writing puzzles for the Daily Telegraph. And I suppose I got started in the authorship question about 2000 when I found a book, In Search of Christopher Marlowe by A.W. Wright, who unfortunately is not around anymore. But I remember reading this book and reading the bits about Shakespeare and thinking, yeah, it's a bit strange, all this. It looks like he didn't write the work. But I remember that there was an argument that Marlowe was murdered above a pub, which seemed quite convincing to me. But there was another argument that he was moved off abroad by the spymaster Walsingham. His death was faked, and he was moved abroad to spy for Walsingham, and that's where he wrote the Shakespeare work. And I didn't buy into that argument. It seemed a bit weak to me. The next step after that was finding a copy of the Bacon Shakespeare question by Nigel Cowan, who was a barrister, another person who is sadly no longer with us. And that was the start of my work, really.
I when I was first introduced to the Shakespeare authorship mystery, I was introduced to it with the idea that Marlowe had been secreted off somewhere to Italy in order to write the works of Shakespeare, and that there was a secret lodged within the sonnets that talked about him being in seclusion and hidden in a tower somewhere where he was writing furiously all of these works. That was my first foray into it as well. But upon further discovery and further research, I realized that, oh yeah, there's plenty of talk about the tower and the sonnets, but it's a completely different story going on in the sonnets than what I had originally been told. So I think a lot of us, when we discover this, we kind of go through our own journey as to looking at the different candidates, and almost like a jury of one, we sort of eliminate candidates based on the evidence that we find. And I'm curious about your discovery here with regards to Francis Bacon's and as you say here, and the title of the book is very clear, Francis Bacon's contribution to Shakespeare. You're not claiming that he is the author Shakespeare. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. I mean, originally I did hold that position back in, 2004 or 5. But what changed my position was when I started my PhD work. And I started using the Early English Books Online database and doing rare phrase searches on the plays. And I discovered there are actually quite a lot of people involved in these plays. And then I changed my whole view of what the question should be. We shouldn't be asking ourselves which individual wrote the Shakespeare plays under a pseudonym, Shakespeare with a hyphen. We should be asking ourselves who are the contributors. That's something we can test by doing. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a laryngitis, so I'll keep going. That's something we can actually test out by doing rare phrase searches. I guess my other problem with the single author theory is that if you just concentrate on one person and only read on the connections between that person and the Shakespeare work, it's easy to convince yourself it's that person. But when you start to look at it in context, when you start to investigate other possible candidates, you get to see that the connections between that candidate and the Shakespeare work are just as good as all the other candidates you've been reading about. So it's not a good way of figuring out who contributed to the Shakespeare work.
I think even Orthodox scholars are having to slowly recognize that there were many quills involved in the composing of many of these works. And I think that one of the things that is so interesting to me and is so intriguing to me is that the circle of names that continue to pop up tend to all, be almost, concentric circles of this tight inner sphere of potential contributors, and then this other sort of outer sphere of potential contributors who, in one way or another, were connected to the people in the inner sphere. I think the key that we see there again and again, and you point this out in your research too, is that the one name that is associated with the pseudonym, the brand, I like to call it, of William Shakespeare, is this William Shaxper of Stratford, who doesn't seem likely to have been involved in any way whatsoever with the composing of this work.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. I think I deviate slightly from that. I'm interested in what his contemporaries thought of him. And if you go to, for example, the second Parnassus play, which was put on at St. John's College around 1600, there are two characters in that, Gullio, which is a play on Gulielmus, which is Latin for William, and Ingenioso. And these plays occurred at the time of the War of the Theatres, which is when Ben Jonson was lampooning other dramatists on the stage through lines that his actors were speaking. And it was serious stuff. They were pointing out each other's defects. And the Parnassus plays were part of this. And I was kind of interested in what was said about Shakespeare. So Guglio seems to be playing the part of Shakespeare in the second Parnassus play. And he's portrayed as someone who employs scholars and appropriates the plays as his own. And I thought to myself, well, in that case, and he's writing lines in them as well. So we see a lot of arguments about the Shakespeare signatures, and he could never write a letter. But I actually think he was literate, and I actually think he supplied lines to the plays. But I think what he actually did was he acquired plays from other dramatists, probably by fair means, paid them a fair sum, and then added lines of his own to them. And there's some evidence in the second Parnassus play that he was actually cutting plays up and putting bits together again. So, making other plays out of parts of several plays.
One of the things that you mentioned in your research, and I want to take this opportunity, and we'll remind listeners throughout the episode where to find your information. You can go to Barry's website. It is barryispuzzled.com, barryispuzzled.com, and that's where you will find Barry Clark's research and also some details about him, his background, his biography, the things that he has done, the plethora of books that he has published full of brain teasers and puzzles. You are an exceptionally smart guy who encourages others to be exceptionally smart, and it's one of the things that I found so intriguing about you. But one of the things that you mentioned in your research is the revels, the Christmas time revels of 1594 and 1595 at Gray's Inn, where you discovered the first noted performance of the Comedy of Errors. And you kind of used that as a springboard into your Francis Bacon research. Explain a little bit more of the detail of that, if you would.
Well, to be fair to others, it was noted before I found it that Comedy of Errors was played at Gray's Inn. There's a document called the Gesta Grayorum, which roughly translates as the Affairs of Gray's Inn. It was a 68-page pamphlet published in 1688 by William Canning. And it says that on Innocents' Day, 28th of December, 1594, a Comedy of Errors like to Plautus his Menaechmus was played by the players, which is the first known performance. Now, I saw this first in Nigel Coburn's book, The Bacon Shakespeare Question, and he developed the argument to some extent, but I thought it could be pushed further. It's one of the two main exclusion arguments, I think, against Shakespeare being involved in a particular play, writing a particular play. And the reason it's an exclusion argument is that there was a document, which is in the Public Record Office in London, which shows that William Shakespeare and the Lord Chamberlain men were at Greenwich performing before the Queen on the same evening that the Comedy of Errors was performed at Gray's Inn. Now, the Comedy of Errors was performed sometime after 9 o'clock. Sometime after 9 o'clock, there was dancing and reveling. So it was probably 9:30, 10 o'clock when it was played. And plays were put on at court before the Queen after 10 o'clock. So they couldn't possibly both be in the same place at the same time. So that was one exclusion argument. Then I started to look at precedent, how many outside companies played at Gray's Inn before the Comedy of Errors was played. And the answer was none. all the plays that were played at Gray's Inn and all the writers of Gray's Inn plays were insiders. They were members of Gray's Inn. So there was no precedent for there being an outside company or an outside writer writing for any of the revels, past revels. And the third thing that struck me was that which I'm trying to, I'm just looking it up here. An interesting fact here is that it's only Lincoln's Inn from 1565 to 80 where professional companies acted at the Inns of Court. So those are the only occasions where we had professional companies. So yeah, that was one exclusion argument. The third thing, which I was trying to remember, was the Gray's Inn Ledger Book and the Gray's Inn Pension Book. Excuse me. The Pension Book was a record of payments that the committee paid for performances, and there was no record of a performance for anybody playing the Comedy of Errors at Gray's Inn, and there was no entry in the ledger book either. And in the Gesta Graiorum, and there's a lot of evidence that it was Francis Bacon that compiled that document, which is an account of the Gray's Inn revels. It says that the revels were played without any chargeable expenses, which means nobody was paid for any performance. So that rules out a professional company. So this is a great exclusion argument against Shakespeare being involved. I mean, both in the writing and in the performance.
It absolutely is. And just to share a little bit of detail so that my listeners understand what we're talking about, the Inns of Court are sort of like, private legal societies. And, there were different inns. And so, sort of like law schools, right? And Gray's Inn is one of the most famous because of the graduates who came through there and the big names that are all associated with Gray's Inn, including Francis Bacon, including Edward de Vere, who is talked about extensively as a contributor at the minimal, if not the editor-in-chief of the Shakespeare works, perhaps. But the point being is that, this country guy from Stratford would have had no connection whatsoever to the Inns of Court. And if he had, as you point out, he would have been paid for doing so. He would have been an outsider brought in and given some sort of remuneration for his play and for the players that he brought with him. So when we look at some of these recorded performances that are unpaid, what we have to sort of try to figure out is, well, who were the actors in the play then, and who wrote the plays that they were playing? And it would occur to me, based on my own personal experience with these types of organizations, is it's the members of the group. And it's not so far-fetched that a member of a special legal society or even the members of your local Rotary Club might put on some sort of mask, some sort of play, some sort of performance at an annual meeting or at a Christmas party, which is basically what this is and what the structure of these performances was at that time.
I mean, not only is it not far-fetched, I mean, there is evidence that Gray's Inn had a playing company, because they actually put on a mask before the Queen at court at Shrovetide for the 1594-5 revels. So they did have a playing company. And we know that in previous years they had a playing company because there are documents that show that. So the Inns of Court did produce plays, and they had their own writers and they had their own players. They didn't need outsiders.
And they didn't need to publish their works because that wasn't the point. That wasn't why they were creating them, right? They were sort of, these fun, insider joke-based type of entertainments that they would do for each other or for their own group or their own society. Not unlike a young child who gathers the children on the block and puts on a play in their backyard, which is something that I used to do when I was a kid. and have continued to do all my life. Basically, a lot of people have softball leagues or bowling leagues. In England, you have cricket teams, I'm sure. But I always say that I gather my friends together and we put on plays. That's what we do.
Well, the plays at Gray's Inn also were quite political. They commented on the succession question. A big question at the time was Queen Elizabeth going to have a heir to the throne? And there were political comments on that in the plays. They didn't get played at court, of course, because it would have upset the Queen, but they were certainly played at the Inns of Court, which, as you say, were the law schools at the time.
You mentioned the early English books online database, EEBO database, and how that played a part in your analyses of rare phrases. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Because I don't think a lot of my listeners are familiar with that database and how extensive it is and how it can be used in this way.
A lot of people have gone to a lot of trouble taking documents from pre-1700 and typing them in word for word into a database. And that's great because it means any researcher can type in phrases and search for them. But you can see by typing a phrase in the search engine, it's a bit like Google. You type a phrase in and see what comes back. So you type a phrase into the front of the EBO search engine, and it tells you what documents contain that phrase. So it's not a new idea to do phrase searching. Brian Vickers was someone who did a lot of this. But I felt that the defect in his method was he wasn't ruling out the idea that these phrases could be commonplace. And the way of ruling that out is to make sure they're rare or infrequent. So what you can do is, what I did was, and it was a painstaking procedure, was to go through a play like The Tempest, starting at line 1, going through phrase by phrase, typing in anything that seemed halfway unusual, and looking at how many documents came back. And if only a small number came back, say 5 or 6, I would take that to be rare. And then I took a note of all the people who also used that phrase. So what you can do is build up a kind of DNA type profile for who shared rare phrases with a play like The Tempest. This is another reason why I think that there are many hands in the Shakespeare work, because when I did this for Henry VI Part 3, Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Anthony Munday were the main people who came up for that. And Francis Bacon didn't come up. So any idea I had before that Bacon was the sole writer of all these plays went out the window. So it was the search through the EBO database, checking, I think I did about 6 plays, 3 pamphlets. It was those searches that convinced me that it's not a single person doing this, it's several people. And they say they don't seem to be connected to each other either.
Another point that you make is with regards to a very enigmatical Shakespeare play that sort of stands apart from the rest of the canon in a lot of ways. And it's Love's Labour's Lost, which is a very interesting and intriguing play that includes, references and characters from places that we don't see anywhere else in the Shakespeare canon. And you found that you believe that the research shows Bacon was a contributor to that play and that it was intended to be performed at Gray's Inn for that same year of 1594-95 revels. Share a little bit about what brought you to that conclusion.
Well, the Gesta Graeorum, which no scholar really disputes that Bacon wrote that, which is an account of the Gray's Inn revels. And I actually did a rare phrase search on that, and Bacon was the only one who shared rare phrases with that document. So I think the evidence is pretty convincing that Bacon wrote that. There are some verbal parallels between the Jester Graiorum and Love's Labour's Lost, and some of them are quite convincing. I mean, there are speeches that Bacon wrote at the revels, the Six Councillors' speeches, and we can see bits of that in Love's Labour's Lost. I also felt, looking through Love's Labour's Lost as well, that I thought it was a message to the law students that they should take their studies seriously and not chase after women. I thought that was the main message of Love's Labour's Lost. But there's an odd thing about that play, because I also found some rare phrases connecting to Thomas Nash, quite a few of those. So whether or not this started life as a Thomas Nash play and then was used at the Inns of Court and bits added to it, I don't know, but it certainly is an odd play, that one.
Yeah, and well, I have a future episode coming with an author who has written a book just about that particular play and its allusions to the we call it courtship of Queen Elizabeth by Ivan the Terrible. And so I'm looking forward to that episode, but I'll be curious also to ask her about the Bacon speeches from Gray's Inn that are sort of mimicked in the play. And, you know, a lot of times when we get these allusions in research, the argument can sort of go both ways. Sometimes the allusion is maybe used to say, see, this play has to predate this reference because it is referenced here. And then sometimes it looks like it could be the other way around, where no, this play must have to come after this reference because the writer of the play was stealing that reference from somewhere else. So you kind of get this, you know, two-way street of researchers who claim one way or the other. No, this came first, you know, it's chicken or the egg, right? Is sort of the argument that we get. But I hadn't heard anywhere else or read anywhere else about Bacon's, you know, particular phrases popping up in the text of Love's Labour's Lost. And I do think it's very interesting that you point out that, you know, here's a guy who was, you know, quite stoic in a lot of ways, who, you know, was maybe making sure that the message that was going to be delivered to the members of this legal society, that they needed to focus more on, you know, sequestering themselves away from the temptations of the world in order to become the greatest scholars that they could be. And I agree that that is somewhat of the message that we see in the play.
Yeah, I think what you were talking about earlier was direction of influence. Well, this was a big dilemma when I was trying to decide who was a contributor to one of the Shakespeare plays. You know, if all somebody's rare phrase matches are before the date of the play, the best you can say is that the play borrowed from them. If all their phrase matches are after the date of the play, you could say this person borrowed from the play. But what turns the person into a contributor is if both directions are present at the same time. That is, there are rare phrases in his work before the date of the play and rare phrases after the date. And then you've got both directions of influence. And yeah, I think there's a good argument for contribution there.
You've also mentioned in your work that you feel Bacon had a great influence on The Tempest. And many people have agreed that The Tempest has some sort of connection to the Virginia colony. And of course, you know, Bacon, not only a member of Gray's Inn on that account, but also a member of the Virginia Company. And obviously, William Shakespeare was not. So here again, we have a situation where it looks like whoever was involved in the writing of this play or contributed in some way had these connections, but obviously the man from Stratford could not have had those connections. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? The Tempest has always been one of those contentious ones where orthodoxy claims that it must have been written far later than most of the people who are described as possible contributors to that play. So therefore that eliminates them from consideration. And then you have, authorship mystery scholars who debunk those claims and say, no, that what the Tempest is referring to is incidents that occurred prior to 1604. Tell me about what you found with regards to that play.
I know the Tempest is a big deal for the Oxfordian researchers because with Oxford dying in 1604, if you want to show that he wrote the entire play, you'd have to date the Tempest back to at least before 1604. And there are a couple of Oxfordian researchers that have done quite a lot of work on this, trying to redate the Tempest. I kind of felt that there was no need. I don't think you can actually date any play unless it's got a fairly strong theme that's topical. I just don't think you can put a date on it. For example, consider this. There could be some unknown writer who writes a play, puts it in a drawer, forgets about it for 20 years. Somebody finds it and decides to add pieces to it. And what he adds to it are topical allusions, maybe something about the gunpowder plot, maybe something about the Virginia colony. So what you can date are the topical allusions in the play, but that doesn't mean the play was written at the time of those topical allusions. It could have been written a long time before by somebody we don't know about and will never know about. So the Oxfordians have spent a lot of time trying to redate plays, but it's not necessary. And I'm quite open to the idea that anybody could have contributed to the Shakespeare work. The Earl of Oxford wrote plays. He could have contributed to the Shakespeare work. And I think there's no need to redate the plays.
That's a very interesting approach because you're right. There are multiple scholars who on a lot of different theories. There, those who support Oxford, those who support Marlowe, those who support Neville, the different positions. Stanley is another one. And, as you just mentioned, that could be an actual good argument that Oxfordians should maybe look at is that, Stanley came along, the son-in-law of the Earl of Oxford, and made some changes and revisions to some of Oxford's work, which is going to make it more difficult to figure out when these phrases, when these lines were added or put in or changed before the first folio of 1623 or whatever the case might be. So that makes a very good point. And you're right, a lot of people have been caught up in the dating of the plays. And I think it's probably because orthodoxy uses that so strongly to lend the best credibility they can to their candidate, the Stratfordian man. And so I think when, the opposition draws a line in the sand, there's a temptation to try to blur that line or to erase it if possible in order to demonstrate that their evidence isn't as strong as they believe it is. But you make a great point that we may never know the dates of many of these plays for the very reason, as you say, sometimes you stick it in a drawer and it hides for 20 years.
Yeah. I've always felt that the difficulty with the Oxford case and with the Neville case, because traditionally authorship attribution has worked on stylistic analysis. Earlier I pointed out why biographical allusions isn't a very effective method of connecting somebody to a play, because you can do this. You could play the game for anybody. You could do it with Bacon. It has been done with Bacon, Neville, Oxford. You could name dozens of candidates, and this has been done for. So it's not a very good method. Stylistic analysis is traditionally the way of doing it. But the problem with Oxford and Neville, there's very little in the early English Online database to do rare phrase searching with, or any kind of stylistic test. So I wish I could suggest a way how Oxford could be shown to be involved in all this with reasonable confidence. but I don't think I can. There's no problem with Marlowe. He's just about got enough in the EBO database to do the searches. Bacon has got a lot of work in the EBO database. And some people might say, well, there's a bias then, because if you've got so much work, of course, you're going to find something that connects him to the plays. But that didn't happen for Henry VI, Part 3. Bacon didn't turn up at all. And with a lot of work in the database, there is an opportunity to eliminate Bacon, because if he doesn't turn up at all, you can be fairly sure he wasn't involved with so much work to search through. So yeah, I think Neville, as I say, has the same problem as Oxford. I think Oxford has some poems, doesn't he, in the EBO database, and there are quite a lot of letters of his which are not in EBO.
That's true. And, but you raise an excellent point that one of the problems that we have with a couple of the candidates who have been thrust forward as being potential contributors or being the sole author is that we don't have a body of work with their name on it. Some would argue that you have, with Oxford, you have someone who is talked about and referenced as a writer by so many others, but there isn't a body of work. And so the big mystery then is, where did his body of work go? And is it possible that his body of work is right in front of us, but written under a pseudonym or two or three? And some theorize that he had multiple pseudonyms. But I think that that's a great point. What's interesting, of course, is that Bacon wrote so much about so many other things that you're right. He does have an extensive, we could call it, library of contribution that's there to be referenced. And I'm glad that you point out that it can be used for and against him, because that's important, I think, and demonstrates that, yes, he may have been a contributor. He may have traveled in the circles of this collective of writers and helped with certain plays, especially those that may have had a very important political stance or message to send. But there is something to be said about some of these others who didn't write about any of the other things that Bacon did, and that they may have then been spending all of their time writing plays and not some of the other types of work that Bacon was known to create.
Yeah, I mean, the guy who has the biggest problem is Mr. Shakespeare himself, because there are no letters or prose works that we could test the plays against to see how much he contributed to them. If we were having this conversation about Ben Jonson, it wouldn't be much of a problem, because there are prose works of his around, so we could do some kind of a test if we thought any of his plays weren't by him. But Shakespeare's a real problem, and I read papers on stylometry, which is word counting, a method of matching a supposed author to a Shakespeare play by checking the frequency of certain words. And the assumption is made that this particular passage is by Shakespeare and another passage isn't. And I think to myself, how could you possibly know that this passage was by Shakespeare if you haven't got any means of testing it? You could say, well, his name's on it, but I mean, his name is on the first folio, but we know that there are lots and lots of other writers involved in these plays, and none of them get any credit in the first folio. So we can't take his name in the first folio as evidence that he contributed to every single play. It's a difficult problem for Shakespeare, and I don't think we could ever know how much he contributed, but I do have a feeling he did contribute something.
Well, that raises a question for me, and I wonder if in your work you tested this at all, but have you tested taking some passages from Jonson's plays and sticking them into the EBO and see if some of those rare phrases pop up in his prose works or in his letters? I mean, does this style of analysis work backwards on writers that we're absolutely sure of in order to prove that it's accurate?
Yeah, and people have suggested to me before that if I want to show that my method's bringing out good results, I should do quite a lot of tests with people who were fairly sure that they wrote the plays if they have their name doing even one play. I mean, it took me maybe 50 or 60 hours of computer time going through The Tempest, for example, checking every phrase, looking at the documents that came up. And Ebo doesn't always attribute people correctly. A document will come up with somebody's name on it, and that guy didn't write that document. It was somebody else. So you've got to go off on a tangent and check that. The amount of checking and cross-checking I had to do was enormous. And after, I think, 5 or 6 plays and 3 pamphlets, I gave up doing it because it was just an enormous task. I mean, too much for one person, I think.
But you were able to obtain a PhD, right? By doing the work that you did do. I noticed in 2014, you achieved a PhD based on this type of research. And it was the phrase, I believe, is passed without amendment, which I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Well, I remember the PhD interview, which was an hour and a half long. And grilling isn't the word for it. Heavily roasted, maybe, something like that. There was a professor from the USA, was one of the examiners. And he took the whole thesis apart word by word. And my supervisor was Bill Leahy, who was at Brunel University at the time. He's moved on since, but he was running the PhD program on Shakespeare authorship at Brunel University. I remember walking down the corridor at the end of the interview, and he walked up to meet me, and the look on his face was as if to say, "They didn't give it to you, did they?" And I said to him, "Yes, they did." And he brought out a bottle of champagne, so that had a nice ending.
Well, there aren't a lot. I've conducted 116, almost 120 interviews now through the episodes of this series, and not all of them have been different guests, because there have been repeat guests. But well over 80 different guests, and I can tell you very few of them have passed that sort of rigorous examination on their work. And so that's definitely a giant feather in your cap in an area like this, where you're basically challenging the walls of academia to crack open and at least look at this type of research and admit that it is worth doing, let alone regardless of whether they agree with your findings, right?
Yeah, well, what especially made the PhD interview difficult was that the second examiner, the internal examiner, was an expert in computer stylistic methods. So I had to pass on 2 counts: my English literature writing and my knowledge of sources had to be quite sound, and my use of computer techniques had to be sound as well. So I felt like I was doing literature and science at the same time. So I think it was doubly difficult for that reason.
Well, your background as a physicist must have come in handy there. Try to, if you can, explain for the listeners how these kind of connect or tie together.
How what to tie together, sorry?
Well, your background as a physicist and how that helped you in this work, and how you applied that as sort of an overlay or an underlying foundation as part of your approach.
Yeah, I mean, I also have an interest in philosophy as well. I've spent a lot of time reading Kant and Schopenhauer, and I'm interested in how we know things. And it turns out, apart from maths and logic, we don't actually know anything. All our knowledge has the character of best guess so far. So we come up with some kind of model, and we test it out. And this was something I couldn't find in the Shakespeare authorship question investigations. People didn't seem to be, any ideas they had, they didn't seem to be putting them to the test. What seems to be the case is that you have different factions who are researching their own candidate, and nobody seems prepared to look at situations where it might not be their candidate. I mean, under what conditions would you say that, for example, Joe Bloggs didn't contribute to the Shakespeare work? What would convince you that he didn't? But the supporters of Joe Bloggs being a contributor are not interested in that question. They don't want to eliminate him. So I was interested in elimination arguments, and I mentioned two already, the Grazing Revels and the Tempest. And the third one was the search of the EBO database, because I thought this is a great way to eliminate people. I mean, if someone doesn't turn up if someone's got quite a lot of work in the EBO database and they don't turn up in the searches, I mean, you could say fairly surely that they haven't got much to do with this play. But that's a bit of a diversion from your question. But what interested me in the Shakespeare authorship question in the first place was that it was a puzzle. And I had an interest in puzzles from quite a long way back. And I thought this would be quite an interesting puzzle to solve. It's an incredibly difficult puzzle to solve, though, because the number of areas you need to be a master of to make any progress is phenomenal. Literature, computer searching, knowledge of sources, knowledge of customs of the time, knowledge of the Inns of Court, what happened at the royal courts. I mean, the number of areas you have to master, I can't say that I've mastered them all. I don't think anybody has. So it's probably one of the most difficult puzzles I think the human race has ever been faced with.
I absolutely agree with you, and I'm becoming more and more convinced that you also need to be a master of multiple languages, at least 5 different languages, in order to solve this puzzle. And one of the things that I've found in my journey and exploration into this is very few people out there who are engaged with this speak multiple languages. And so I'm always fascinated when I have a guest who does speak multiple languages and can approach this puzzle from that sort of a perspective that so many others are not able to do. You know, the great majority of researchers are English speaking only. And some would say, well, that's because, you know, he's the father of English. Yeah, but I think that the works of Shakespeare demonstrate that the father of English created so much of that English based on his particular knowledge of multiple languages, such as Latin and Greek and Italian and French and even German, as we see in so much of the writing that pops up through there. You know, some could argue, well, English is a Germanic language, so that makes sense. But I think that there are so many word meanings that are used, and particularly when you talk about these rare phrases, these writers, no matter how many there were and no matter who contributed, they also had mastery of some of these languages that we don't have today. They had to study Latin. It was a part of the curriculum, right? Who studies Latin anymore besides lawyers and doctors? I don't think anyone really, right? So I think that's another aspect of the puzzle that is interesting.
Yeah, I think Shakespeare, having gone to a grammar school, would have to have studied Latin, but oddly enough, they didn't teach English at these grammar schools. So how he mastered the intricacies of English, I have no idea. How he wrote all these plays single-handedly without having access to a library is anybody's guess. It's just a very odd situation that he... I mean, I remember going to a lecture by Stanley Wells, actually, in 2005, Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford. And about 60 people turned up in the cafe area and the chairs were set out. And this lecture was titled Shakespeare Authorship. So, of course, you had a lot of people going along who were interested in Shakespeare authorship. So I went along and listened. But it wasn't anything at all to do with Shakespeare authorship. He just went on about the people he'd met during his long career. And one or two of the crowd are getting a bit frustrated because, of course, they'd come along to hear about who authored the Shakespeare plays. So a woman stood up and started asking him about Marlowe. Did Stanley Wells think that Marlowe contributed to the Shakespeare work? And this is a quote. This is what Stanley Wells actually said. I am immovable in my view that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the work. And I thought to myself afterwards, well, that closes it all down then, really, doesn't it? There's no discussion of any kind. And it's not a position that any scientist, any serious scientist would take up. Any serious scientist would be challenging his own hypotheses. And I think anybody who says they're completely certain about anything, I think we should be a bit suspicious.
Well, no, that's the second time that you've sort of raised that point, and I think it is important to note, one of the truths about orthodoxy is they have been immovable. And as you pointed out, when it comes to different people who have their candidates, they tend to turn a blind eye to any area of research that they feel is threatening to their position. And I have found that to be true not just with Stratfordians, but with Oxfordians as well. I've found that to be true with Marlovians. I haven't found that to be true with Baconians, and I think part of that is because Baconians see their man as being a man who would never be closed down to that type of inquiry, which I think is very interesting. But you're right. There are so many out there and so many who claim to be scholars with, quotes, air quotes around the word scholars, who don't actually have a scholarly approach. They're dismissive of other people's research. They are judgmental of what they call fringe theories, or in some cases, I find it always ironic that there are certain members of the Shakespeare authorship mystery community who are so afraid of being labeled a lunatic that they attack fellow enthusiasts because they think it brings some sort of smear upon them. And I always like to say, I hate to break it to you, but we're all lunatics. We're all the crazy conspiracy theorists out here. There are no degrees of conspiracy theory when the other side wants to label you. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, my ally, regardless of how out there their approach to their journey in this mystery might be, is still my ally. They're still my friend, and we should stop casting stones upon each other's work just because we're afraid that the orthodoxy is going to label us as flat earthers. But you make a great point that it really has gotten in the way of what could be some great research, and we ought to be able to embrace turning over every stone, even if doing so is only doing so to eliminate having to turn that stone in the future.
And what I do notice about some Baconians, not all Baconians, but some Baconians I've come across, one or two of them seem to have mental health problems. And I'll tell you why I say that. There was one person I visited once who was interested in Francis Bacon, and he said, do you see that glass jar on the table? I said, yeah. He said, I can see a salamander in that jar. I looked and I couldn't see a salamander. There was another person I went to a Bacon Society meeting, and she stood up and said that the previous evening she'd been in contact with Francis Bacon and got some messages from him. And then there was another person I was in a meeting with at the Francis Bacon Society who suddenly came out and said, I have the power to float around the room. And I don't know, maybe all these people do have these superpowers, but I, personally don't believe it. And it kind of, seems a bit strange to me.
Well, belief that Sir Francis Bacon contributed to the works of Shakespeare stands apart from belief in telekinesis or astral projection or levitation. So I don't think that they necessarily have to be combined. People can be crazy in one way and quite brilliant in another. We always hear that about Albert Einstein, for instance, and certainly some of the most intelligent and creative people in history have had extreme aspects to their personalities, and many of them have been very well documented. I mean, look at Mozart, for instance, is a very specific and good example. Benjamin Franklin is another one. Thomas Edison is another one. I mean, these are people who had brilliance to a level that seemed to interfere with other aspects of their personality and behaviors. So I don't know that that's necessarily a reason to dismiss one area as another. Delia Bacon, the most famous Baconian, spent the end of her life locked up in a sanitarium. I don't think that it means she was wrong about Bacon having something to do with Shakespeare. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of the early Baconians had a belief in the occult. I guess what I'm really saying is I haven't seen this so much, amongst the Marlowe people or the Oxfordian people. It seems to be a thing I've only seen amongst the Baconians. And I'm not saying all Baconians. I'm just saying I've seen it quite a lot in that kind of society.
Well, let's talk about one of the most famous Baconians, and it's because it's connected to your work. You talk about on your website about how the experience that you had with Sir Mark Rylance, where you spent several hours with him discussing the issue of Bacon being a contributor to Shakespeare. And I know that he agrees with that. And obviously he agrees with that because he wrote a very extensive foreword to your book, Francis Bacon's Contribution to Shakespeare, A New Attribution Method. Tell us a little bit about that and how that connection was made and some of the most interesting points that you shared together that made him agree to write this 7-page foreword to your book.
Well, I think Mark has always said that his interest in Francis Bacon came from a desire to understand the plays better, that he felt that he could make better sense of the plays if they were seen through a Baconian lens. I guess, that's a point of view he's put in print, so there's no dispute about that. Exactly what he believes privately, you'd have to ask him about that. I'm not entirely sure, but he, as far as what I've read in all his writings, he is open to the idea that just about anybody could have contributed to the Shakespeare work. Yeah, I did go to his house and have quite a long discussion with him on. I think he was writing a play about fish at the time. I think that's what it was about. And we had a board that he was plotting it all out on, which I thought was quite impressive. And I was also impressed by his 17th century book collection with books bound in calf skin. But yeah, he told me a number of things about the authorship community that I didn't know about, which I was fascinated about what various people believed and things.
Well, it must have been quite a coup for you to invite him to write the foreword to your book and for him to agree to do so as part of sort of like the dot on the exclamation point of having the book published by Routledge, which isn't very long ago, ladies and gentlemen. It was 2019 that Barry's book hit the bookshelves, and you can find it at just about any of the online book sources, including Amazon, of course. But you can also find it at Barry's website. And remember, that's barryispuzzled.com. Barry is Barry, and puzzled spelled, of course, with 2 Z's. So barryispuzzled.com is where you can find more information about Barry's work and a link to his book, as well as some of his really interesting brain teaser books, because, as he mentioned, he is a puzzle solver, and that's what got him interested in this topic. Barry, before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners regarding your book, regarding your work, anything that they need to know that I haven't covered in this interview?
Well, the name Barry is Puzzled. Somebody suggested it should be Barry is Puzzling, but no, Barry is Puzzling expresses the idea that I think I'll always be in the situation of not knowing. And I'm afraid that's the human condition.
Well, it's true. And, I'm pleased to have you as a fellow quiller. And it appears to me that Barry is puzzled is the proper way, because I myself am puzzled. And I think so many of us are, especially by this great mystery, which is why the theme of this program has always been to keep asking questions. It's the only way that we can get to the bottom of the truth. So I appreciate the work that you have done in asking these questions, and I appreciate you being our guest today to answer some of mine.
Thank you, and
go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and one last thing I will point out is that you did do a presentation on the Greys in Revels for the Shakespeare Authorship Trust in 2020. Is that presentation available online somewhere where my listeners can find that and watch that?
Yeah, there's a Barry is Puzzled YouTube site, and there seems to be a theme through the presentations I do. When I was doing that presentation, I had a very heavy cold. While I'm talking to you now, I've got a touch of laryngitis. So these things always seem to appear when I'm doing some kind of presentation. I don't know why that is.
Perhaps you have psychosomatic symptoms brought on by a nervous fear of giving presentations in front of people.
I'll ask my therapist about that
one. Good, because I'm definitely not a therapist. Thank you again, Barry. I appreciate your time and appreciate having you. Before we wrap things up, fellow quillers, don't forget that you can find our growing library of bonus features at our Patreon page, and you can get there right from the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. You can also subscribe to our email list from a button on that homepage of the website, don'tquillthepodcast.com, as well as find the link to our swag shop to purchase your very own Don't Quill the Messenger merchandise. I'm wearing my DQTM t-shirt right now. The best part of visiting the Patreon page is learning about the various levels of patronage you can sign up for, including the Serial Quiller level, where you can access those bonus features and qualify for our Quiller of the Month drawing, which producer Jake is going to conduct and announce right now.
Thanks, Stephen, and hello, Quillers. 'Tis I, Jake Lloyd Bacon, here once again with the honor and privilege of naming this month's Quiller of the Month. I do apologize if the audio quality here is not that great. Forced to record this today here on my iPhone in a closet because my fiance and I, the ever so charming Alexandra Hoy, are planning a move, and so things are a bit hectic. But this is not about me. This is about you, the patrons. If you're not sure what this is, well, head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger and find out. Each and every month, I add all of the eligible patrons' names into a hat and select one at random who becomes our monthly Quiller of the Month, who gets a free item of their choosing from the shop over at dragonwagonshop.com. Without further ado, let's go ahead and see who the winner for the month of September is. Frank Lawler. Frank Lawler, congrats. I believe this is Frank's second, maybe even third time being Quiller of the Month. Just goes to show you there's no limit to how many times you can win. Every month that you are an eligible patron, you get entered into the contest. Frank, keep your eye on your email as well as through the Patreon. We'll send you a message on how to claim your winnings. Congrats, and thanks again to everybody who continues to support this little show. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for all you do to make sure Don't Quill the Messenger continues to be the quality podcast that it is every 2 weeks for the Quiller Nation. Hey, fellow Quillers, as this episode dropped to your favorite streaming location, my wife Annie and I are on an airplane on our way to Italy. It has been a trip 10 years in the making, and it's finally happened. In addition to some very traditional touristy things on our itinerary, we are also planning to visit a vast number of Shakespearean sites during our time in Italia. And we can't wait to tell you all about our visit in a future episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, so watch for that to come sometime in October. I'll also be doing a future episode detailing the full itinerary of our Quiller event in April in Minneapolis, Minnesota. William Shakespeare Esquire was the bard the greatest legal mind of all time? And our discussion today about Gray's Inn and the Inns of Court will be connected to that in some ways as well. We'll walk you through the entire weekend's events, from the opening night cocktail reception to the legal presenters and the scenes from the plays they will cover, to the beauty of the historic hotel and the grandeur of the event venue where we will be hosting our events, plus the exciting bonus marathon day of Shakespeare history plays. And we'll tell you how you can obtain your Shakespeare Marathon medal as part of your package. All of that and more coming your way from Don't Quill the Messenger, so make sure you join that email list to keep up to date. I want to once again thank my guest, Barry Clark, for yet another exciting and interesting episode of the show. Remember to visit barryispuzzled.com to find his work and a link to purchase his book. And until next time, Quiller Nation, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.